In his book, The History of Jazz, by Ted Gioia, he talked about the early precursors of jazz, and one of these sections is about Scott Joplin and ragtime. Ragtime music rivals the blues in importance and perhaps surpasses it in influence as a predecessor to early jazz. Indeed, in the early days of New Orleans jazz, the line between ragtime and jazz was so fine that the two terms were often used interchangeably. For the benefit of hindsight, we can draw sharp distinctions between the two genres, but in the context of African American music in turn-of-the-century New Orleans, the grounds for such subtle delineations were hardly so clear. In his Library of Congress recordings, Jelly Roll Morton demonstrated an illuminating comparison of two ways of playing Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag, one reflecting the Missouri ragtime tradition, and the second showing a New Orleans jazz-inflected approach to the composition. But even with Morton, the dividing line between these two styles can be elusive. In the same series of interviews, Morton asserted that the celebrated jazz pianists of the 1930s, such as Fats Waller and Art Tatum, were simply ragtime pianists in a very fine form. Few jazz historians would agree with this later characterization, but statements such as these reveal how fluid the borderline between ragtime and jazz could seem to educated listeners, and not just at the turn of the century, but well into the era of swing music and big bands. Perhaps the best way of understanding the differences and similarities between these two musical idioms is to distinguish between ragtime as a manner of composition and ragtime as a style of instrumental, primarily piano, performance. The similarities Morton perceived between ragtime and 1930s jazz relate primarily to keyboard techniques, most notably the striding on-the-beat bass employed by the left hand and the riveting right-hand syncopations. The latter were often so predominant in ragtime that entire melody lines might be constructed out of the repeated syncopation figures. The result, at its worst, was a melody so convoluted and inherently pianistic that few vocalists could sing it, and fewer would want to. But even the second-rate rag pieces compensated for this lack of melodic integrity through the manic rhythmic intensity of their two-handed assault on the keys. In ragtime's finer moments, especially in the mid and late career efforts of Scott Joplin, these devices were subtly incorporated into his supremely memorable melodies. The syncopations employed in the same way a master chef adds spice to a recipe, for shades of flavour, not overpowering effect. The left-hand structures of ragtime were equally influential, while a whole generation of jazz pianists adopted its use of resounding low bass note or octave, sometimes a fifth or tenth, on beats 1 and 3, followed by a middle register chord on beats 2 and 4. The resulting combination of the pounding 4-in-a-bar foundation of the left hand and the rhythmic acrobatics of the right hand was a full-bodied piano sound that required no other accompaniment. This style of performance became known as ragging or ragged time at some point in the 19th century, a term that later served as a source for the generic title ragtime. Ragtime rhythms appeared in print as early as the first half of the 19th century, but the first published ragtime piece is generally acknowledged to be Mississippi Rag, 1897, composed by William Krell. Later that same year, Tom Turpin became the first black composer to publish a ragtime composition with his work Harlem Rag. Both are well crafted and suggest that the ragtime style had been in incubation for some time prior to their appearance. Before the year was out, Ben Harney had published his method book, Ragtime Instructor, the first of many pedagogical works that built on and fueled the public's appetite for this intoxicating new music. By the turn of the century, the ragtime craze was in full swing, so much so that highbrow critics felt compelled to attack it. "Ragtime's days are numbered," declared Metronome magazine in 1901. "We are sorry to think that anyone should imagine that ragtime was of the least musical importance. It is a popular wave in the wrong direction." That same year, the American Federation of Musicians ordered its members to desist from playing ragtime, declaring, "The musician knows what is good, and if the people don't, we will teach them." In the midst of this rapid dissemination of music styles, the term rag invariably became both overused and misapplied, often employed indiscriminately to denote a wide range of African American musical idioms. As a result, published compositions from this period may use the word rag in their title, while bearing little resemblance to what has become known as classical rag style, just as many so-called blues compositions strayed sometimes considerably from the standard 12-bar form. But as the style evolved, ragtime coalesced into a structured 4-theme music, with each melody typically encompassing 16 bars. The most common form for these classic rag pieces was AA, BB, A, CC, DD, with a modulation to a different key typically employed for the C theme. Although the published ragtime composition came to include vocal works and band arrangements, this style reached its highest pitch as a form of solo piano music. Nor should this be surprising. In many ways, the spread of this jubilant new music went hand in hand with the growing popularity of pianos in the turn of the century American households. Between 1890 and 1909, total piano production in the United States grew from 100,000 instruments per year to over 350,000. And it is worth noting that in 1909 marked the peak level not only of American piano production, but also in the number of ragtime pieces published. By 1911, a staggering 295 separate companies engaged in the manufacture of pianos had set up operations in the United States. By comparison, there are only 3 local producers remaining today, while another 69 businesses serve the market for piano supplies. During this same period, player pianos increasingly made their way into homes and gathering places. In 1897, the same year that witnessed the publication of the first ragtime piece, the Angelus cabinet player piano, the first such instrument to use a pneumatic push-up device to depress the keys, was released to an enthusiastic marketplace, and by 1990, player pianos constituted over half the output of the US piano industry. These two powerful trends, the spread of pianos into American households and the growing popularity of the mechanical player pianos, helped spur the enormous public appetite for ragtime music during the early years of the 20th century. This unprecedented outpouring of ragtime artistry was centred to a striking degree in a fairly small geographical area. Just as the rural blues blossomed in the hothouse atmosphere of the Mississippi Delta, and as early jazz would later flourish in the environs of New Orleans, so early ragtime reached its zenith in turn of the century Missouri. The cities of Sedalia, Carthage, and St. Louis, among others, serving as home base for a who's who of ragtime composers, as well as an ambitious group of music publishers who recognise the extraordinary body of talent at hand. In Sedalia, a booming railroad town that almost became the state capital, Scott Joplin gathered a cadre of performing rag composers around him, including his students Scott Hayden and Arthur Marshall, while Sedalia music publisher John Stark, a major advocate of ragtime in general and Joplin in particular, proved to be an important catalyst in bringing the work of these local composers to the attention of the broader public. Stark, Joplin and Hayden eventually moved to St. Louis, another major centre of rag activity during these glory years. The local composers there also included Louis Chevron, an exceptionally talented native of the city who left behind all too few compositions, as well as Tom Turpin and Artie Matthews. In Carthage, Missouri, James Scott created a number of outstanding ragtime pieces, many of which were published by the local Dumas musical store, where Scott worked, initially washing windows and sweeping floors, and later as serving a composer in residence. Eventually, Scott also benefited from a fruitful partnership with Stark, one that produced a body of compositions second only to Joplin's as exemplars of the ragtime style. With the exception of Joseph Lamb, a white composer from Montclair, New Jersey, virtually all the leading exponents of the classic rag style made their home at one point or another in Missouri. Scott Joplin stands out as the greatest of these composers. In fact, the resurgence of interest in ragtime that began in the 1970s would be hard to imagine if it were not for the timeless appeal of Joplin's music. While others may have written rags that were more technically demanded or that boasted more striking novelty effects, none could approach the structural elegance and melodic inventiveness or the range of expression that characterized Joplin's major works. Nor would any other rag composer match Joplin's ambitions for the music. Ambitions that led to the composition of 2 operas, a ballet, and other works that squarely challenged the lowbrow reputation of the rag idiom. Although his more daring works never gained the acceptance, at least during his lifetime, that Joplin craved, his oeuvre stands out today all the more due to the high standards to which he aspired. As well as to his determined belief in ragtime as a serious form of music, a belief that more than half a century after Joplin's death became validated by his belated enshrinement as a major American composer. Joplin was born in Texarkana, Texas, probably in 1868. His father, the former slave Giles Joplin, had played the violin for house parties given by the local slave owner in the days before the Emancipation Proclamation, while his mother, Florence Given Joplin, sang and played the banjo. The latter instrument may have had an impact on Scott's musical sensibilities. The syncopated rhythms of 19th century African-American banjo music are clearly predecessors of the later piano rag style. The banjo itself has a fascinating lineage. In America, it's considered the plaything of hillbillies and rustics, but its roots are clearly African, where it is prefigured in many variants and is associated with bards and nobility. It is all too fitting that Scott Joplin's earliest encounters with music came by this rare American survival of lofty African performance traditions. While Scott was still in his youth, his father left the family, and his mother was forced to rely on work as a domestic to support her 6 children. The future composer already exhibited his affinity for the keyboard at this early age. He often accompanied his mother to houses where she worked and would play and improvise on the piano while she went about her chores. By his teens, Joplin had established himself as a professional pianist, with opportunities to ply his trade at churches, clubs, and social gatherings in the border town of Texas and Arkansas. In the border area of Texas and Arkansas. Later, he became involved in teaching music as well as singing with a vocal quintet that performed widely in the region. During this period, Joplin made his first attempts at composition. At some point in the mid-1880s, Joplin moved to St. Louis, where he supported himself primarily as a pianist, both as a soloist in saloons and other night spots as well as with a band. The ensemble work gave Joplin an opportunity to develop the skills in arranging that would later reach its pinnacle in orchestrations for his 2 operas. Joplin made his home in St. Louis for almost a decade, but he travelled widely during these years. He visited in 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a massive fair that attracted some of the finest musicians of the day. Many have been especially influential. Although ragtime music had not yet been published, it was apparently widely played at the exposition, albeit most often in the outskirts of the fairgrounds where black musicians performed, while the choicer, more centrally located venues were reserved for white entertainers. At some point in the mid-1890s, Joplin settled down in Sedalia, where he eventually undertook formal study of harmony and composition at the nearby George R. Smith College. Around 1897, Joplin wrote The Maple Leaf Rag, a composition that was destined to become the most famous ragtime piece of its day. It wasn't until 2 years later that John Stark published the work, and over the next 12 months only 400 copies were sold. But in the fall of 1900, the Maple Leaf Rag caught on with the general public and became the first piece of sheet music to sell more than 1 billion copies, a figure all the more stunning when one realizes that there were fewer than 100,000 professional musicians and music teachers in the United States at that time. Amateur pianists, for their part, must have found it anything but easy to navigate the technical and rhythmic difficulties of Joplin's celebrated rag. However, many no doubt purchased the sheet music and laboured over its intricate syncopations. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see that the Maple Leaf Rag only hinted at the full extent of Joplin's talent. It lacks the melodic subtlety, compositional ingenuity, and emotional depth that would eventually separate Joplin from other rag composers. But in rhythmic intensity, the Maple Leaf Rag stands out even today. Put simply, it is the most intoxicating syncopated of all Joplin's rag. If the essence of ragtime's popularity was, as Irving Berlin later suggested, its ability to capture the speed and snap of modern American life, then no piece of music evokes this emerging sensibility better than the Maple Leaf Rag. Later Joplin pieces revealed the wide range of compositional techniques that this ambitious African-American composer had mastered. The parlor waltz refinement of Bethina, 1905, the coy interludes that temper the syncopations of the Ragtime dance, 1906, the boogie-woogie inflected third section of Pineapple Rag, 1908, the language habanera rhythms of Solace, 1909, the almost self-parodying syncopations of Stop Time Rag, 1910, and the moving minor key sections of Magnetic Rag, 1914. With the Brahmsian darkness of Scott Joplin's New Rag, 1912, and especially his Magnetic Rag, the last piece he completed, Joplin pushed his compositions far beyond the boisterous beer hall ambience that characterized, for many listeners and players, the ragtime idiom. This was music on a large scale that was now being squeezed into the narrow confines of the rag form. So much so that the songs seem almost consciously designed to defy the commercial expectations that Joplin's earlier successes has engendered. These genre-breaking excursions into other styles were defining qualities of Joplin's music. Accounts that stress his role in uplifting and refining the rag idiom mostly miss the point. True, Joplin set high goals for himself, but his relationship to rag was more one of fighting against its constraints and stylistic dead ends rather than battling for its honour and glory. Joplin's ambition is to shine in other spheres, a 1903 newspaper article about him recounts. He affirms that it is only a pastime for him to compose syncopated music, and he longs for more arduous works. Joplin was also ambivalent at times even hostile towards the pyrotechnics of most rag pianists, which emphasized speed and showmanship at the expense of melodic beauty. Hence the well-known admonition that graces many of his published compositions. Note, do not play this fast. It is never right to play ragtime fast. The most controversial result of Joplin's high-flung aspirations was his opera Treemonisha, often misleadingly referred to as a ragtime opera, but which was very little ragtime in it. Instead, it probes deeply into the pre-rag folk roots of black American music, as well as taps the full range of European operatic devices. The work comes complete with orchestration, overture, recitatives, arias, and ensembles. The last years of Joplin's life found him increasingly preoccupied with this project. It made enormous demands on the composer, not only because of the massive scale of the work, but perhaps even more from the considerable challenge of finding financial and public support for the undertaking. Around 1903, Joplin had written a first opera, now lost, titled A Guest of Honour, which apparently kept fairly close to the ragtime style. Treemonisha proved to be a far more expansive and consuming musical project. As early as 1907, Joplin may have discussed the new opera with U.B. Blake, and the following year he played parts of it for Joseph Lamb. John Stark turned down the work, sensing the poor commercial prospects of an African-American folk opera. It was not until 1911 that Joplin, financing the venture himself, was able to publish the 230-page score for piano and 11 voices. His single-minded focus on the opera forced Joplin to ignore more lucrative publishing opportunities. The year before the release of the piano score, only one other Joplin rag appeared in print, causing financial difficulties for the composer and precipitating a break with Stark. Undeterred, Joplin proceeded with the daunting task of orchestrating the lengthy works and seeking financial backing for a full-scale production. On completing the orchestration, Joplin began auditioning singers, determined to stage the opera at his own expense to test the public response. A single performance took place in 1915 in the Harlem Hall, with an under-rehearsed cast, no scenery or costumes, and without an orchestra, merely the composer playing the piano score. The work, staged in such an austere manner, generated little enthusiasm at the time among a Harlem audience more interested in assimilating established artistic traditions than in celebrating the roots of African American culture. In the fall of 1916, a year after the disastrous performance of Trishmanisha, Joplin was committed to the Manhattan State Hospital. On April 1st, 1917, Joplin died from dementia paralytica cerebral, brought on by syphilis. Although he had not yet reached his 50th birthday, Joplin had already outlived his fame. The ragtime craze in America had passed, and Joplin's popularity had waned to such an extent that a number of his unpublished compositions remained hidden away in the Stark Company files and were eventually destroyed when the operation moved in 1935. Other compositions, which may have included a piano concerto, came into the hands of Wilbur Sweetman, who was executor of Joplin's widow's estate, but they too have disappeared. The various books on African American music written in the decades following the composer's death devoted little or no space to Joplin, and it was not until Rudy Blesh and Harriet Janis published their seminal work They All Played Ragtime in 1950 that Joplin's extraordinary career began to be understood in any degree of perspective. And it took the surprising and unprecedented ragtime resurgence in the 1970s before Joplin's work took the next step and moved beyond the confines of scholars and specialists to re-enter the mainstream American culture. In the mid-1970s, Joplin's popularity and the sales of recording of his music matched rock-style levels. One piece, The Entertainer, even became the basis for a hit single. But most gratifying to Joplin would have been the eventual success of his opera Trishmanisha, some 60-odd years after its failed debut. The work was fully revived and recorded, and its composer posthumously awarded a Pulitzer Prize. And if you're interested in seeing that, it's actually on YouTube. Joplin's single-minded determination to merge vernacular African music with mainstream traditions of Western composition prefigured in many regards the later development of jazz. By straddling the borders of highbrow and lowbrow, culture, art music and popular music, African polyrhythms and European formalism, Joplin anticipated the fecund efforts of later artists such as Duke Ellington, James P. Johnson, Benny Goodman, Charles Mingus, Stan Kenton, Art Tatum, Wynton Marsalis, among others. In his own day, Joplin's audience, both black and white, or white and black as it's written here, was ill-prepared to understand the nature of such hybrid efforts. We can easily imagine them harbouring a preconception that these different traditions were too radically opposed to allow seamless merging. The idea of a ragtime ballet or opera must have seemed an oxymoron to most of those on both sides of the great racial divide that characterized the turn of the century American society. It required the development of a different aesthetic before such works could be appreciated on their own terms. In our own day, we have embraced just such a new aesthetic, one that allows the audience not only to accept, but often to rush to praise willy-nilly various transformations of popular styles of entertainment into serious art. This tendency is evidently not only, or even primarily, in jazz, but in virtually every contemporary genre and style of creative human expression. But even in tolerant, liberal-minded times, the tension between these two streams of activity continues to seethe under the surface. This dynamic interaction and clash and fusion of African and European composition and improvisation, spontaneity and deliberation, the popular and the serious, high and low, will follow us in virtually every turn as we unfold the complex history of jazz music in his book, The History of Jazz, by Ted Gioia.